Right, I'm going to start. I've got a can of coffee. Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction from Sky News with me, Beth Rigby.
Me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman.
Now, we are all in Glasgow ahead of our final live show of our mini tour. Ruth and Harriet, you're together in a studio. And I'm in a hotel because I've literally just landed from New York. Less than 24 hours in the Big Apple. I did manage to get my daughter some Jolly Ranchers, though, as required or requested. It's been a whirlwind of a trip. I'm not quite sure if it's night or day, but we have lots to discuss, don't we? So should we get on with it? Because I do need to go back to bed, it is true. Now, the week of the Labour Party conference and whether it was overshadowed by the freebies row, we're going to talk about that. We talked about it last week, but it's rolling on. Can I also say, Ruth, the joy of when I was doing the leader's speech, Keir Starmer's speech, you have to sort of, when you're doing my job, you're going to do a piece to camera as Keir Starmer finishes the speech. And I was crawling on my knees across the floor to not get in anyone's way. And I looked up and there was Harriet in a beautiful green jacket on the front row as I crawled past her on my knees. That was nice, wasn't it, Harriet?
I thought, well, there's no lengths that political editors don't have to go to be in the right place at the right time for the right political story.
Were you not tempted, Harriet, to just, as she crawled past, just to stick your feet up and put them on her back and just use her as a footstool,
I
no?
thought it was the wrong way around. I should have been kneeling in front of Beth.
Never. It was very funny. I sort of was crawling past. I was like, oh, hi, Harriet. I'm just crawling past you. It was lovely to see you there, though, Harriet. Well, look, we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about the UK response to the conflict in the Middle East. But look, let's start. As I was saying, I was in New York to interview the PM. Leaders always do rounds with political editors after their conference speech, although actually the Conservatives do it the day before the conference speech, but Labour always do it the day after. But this one was one with a twist because quite late in the day, the Prime Minister decided that he was going to go to the United Nations General Assembly straight after conference. Now, I think they'd originally thought he wasn't going to go because it did clash with conference. But because of what's going on in the world, what the number of world leaders that would go into this United Nations General Assembly, he decided to go straight from his conference speech. I can safely say I think the Prime Minister has definitely had a harder week than me. He must be so tired. So he did his interviews with political editors out in New York. So I saw him yesterday. I had 10 minutes with him. We're going to play a clip of the interview. You can sort of have a listen to how it was.
My wife and I promised our children would protect them, and we will. But in both those cases, no money changed hands. It was simply a gift from Arsenal.
It feels to me you're a bit defensive. Like, do you feel you're being misunderstood on this, that we shouldn't be, that there are reasons behind all these expenses?
I think it's really important you ask me the questions. That's why the declarations are there. But, this is just, I think behind some of these numbers is a human story, and it's all important sometimes just to explain what the story is.
But I want to go back to the framing of it, which is you have said that we are all in this together. You said in your speech yesterday, it's a shared struggle, a project that says to everyone this will be tough. To coin a phrase, we're all in it together. And for some of it, whether you like it or not, it will look to some people that we're not all in it together, that because of your position, you get privilege and freebies that other people don't have access to. Take GCSEs. There will be some people that would also want a private place, have a different environment where they would like their child to go so they could have a better opportunity. Do you see how it looks to some people that there's one rule for you in terms of being able to claim this stuff that other people don't have access to?
Well, I think that's why the rules are there, to declare it. But look, every day...
Do you get it, though?
Every day...
Do you get how it looks?
If you're putting to me, Beth, that I should have stayed in my Kentish Town home and disrupted my son's GCSEs, that was the right thing to do, then I think you should put that to me.
So that was an exchange about the freebies route. I actually... Even though we're in United Nations, it was a kind of domestic interview because it was on the back of conference. What I was trying to do, what I wanted to do, was asking him about the row, how he felt about it, what did he want to say about it, and it went on a bit of a different tack that I wasn't really expecting. The issue around this is that Lord Ali, who you might have heard of because he is the guy that bought the clothes for Keir Starmer, bought the clothes for Vic, his wife, he bought the glasses, he's lent his flat to Angie Rayner. It emerged that in Keir Starmer's expenses over the election, there was a line in there for £20,000 for accommodation. Lord Ali had lent the Starmers his £18 million penthouse while his son was studying for his GCSEs. And the reason that Starmer gave was that because, as Harriet was saying, there was a gauntlet of press. He wanted his son to have a peaceful place to study. He said to me, I will not let my son fail. I need to protect my family. And though he had moved his family into this flat, I'm going to come back to kind of, I didn't even bring this up in the interview. I'm just saying he brought this up. I wasn't actually going to ask him necessarily about this. What I was asking about was the broader picture of the £107,000 of donations over the previous
I
parliament.
thought he was absolutely mad for taking the line that he took, because it took 6 or 7 days for them to get dragged to a point where they were accepting that £107,000 worth of freebies, more than double any other MP, looked bad, and to stand up and say, look, do you know what? I'm not going to take any more free clothes, no more free glasses. Rachel Reeves is not going to take any more free clothes. Angela Rayner's not going to take any more free clothes. And just, and draw a line under it. And then the way he dug in with you, and he reopened another front talking about his son and this £20,000 flat that he got from, Lord Ali to study in and stuff like that. He went back on the kind of acceptance that there was going to be a different way of doing things going forward. And he re-dug in. And that just opens the story back up again. And I think he was really tetchy. It was proper, like almost Rishi Sunak level of tetchiness. And we haven't really seen that since the election, which is not very appealing. He was very defensive. And I just think you gave him an out when you were saying that, some people might see this as given opportunities, being given handouts that other people don't have access to. I mean, he could have easily just said, yes, some people might see it like that. And some people might also see it as a father who is in a situation which is really unpleasant, for people who don't know what it's like to have 30 or 40 people outside your door every day when your kids are trying to get in and out of their front door, feeling like they're hunted, feeling like they can't leave their own house, feeling like they've got no space. We felt that we had to do what we thought was right as parents. He reopened the stuff about football, which has kind of almost died down. 40 grand is a lot of football tickets. Like it's a number that that's more than the average salary of like people in the United Kingdom. Like that's a lot of money. And there was a point where you said, don't you get that people just see this and they just think it's like Boris? It's just like your rich mate buy you stuff and give you stuff. And you could see him almost kind of flinch internally at it, because he does not see himself like somebody who's on the take. He sees himself as a very moral man, a very decent man, but it is comparable. It's exactly the same thing. Taking stuff for free from your rich mates is the same whether you're Labour or whether you're Tory. I get really upset and angry at the level of kind of double standards and sanctimony of the left, where they think, and lots of people in Labour think, if the Tories do it, it must be corruption, but if they do it, it's explainable. And if it's the same thing, then it needs to be judged the same way.
Harriet, can I get your take? Because last week you said, and I know you have quite a lot of sympathy for Keir Starmer, and I'll come on to kind of what I thought about it. But last week you said that you thought he was making things worse by trying to justify some of these gifts. He has shifted a bit, hasn't he? Since last week, he said, I won't take any more clothes and I won't take any more glasses. He's not saying he won't take tickets anymore.
Well, I still think this issue is not sorted out. And his tone in response to your interview was just dripping with frustration and kind of resentment. And I could imagine he was thinking, for God's sake, I've just got the Labour Party elected into government. He went from leader of the opposition to doubling the number of Labour MPs. I'm Prime Minister now. And now I'm in the UN, where the whole Middle East is nearly going up in flames. Why are you still asking me about this? I think in relation to the question of him moving into the flat during the general election campaign. I think the first thing to say is, why on earth was it all right for the press to be camped outside his house when he's got, young children there and a wife, who were not standing for election, who were not in the election campaign, and his house was besieged? And I've said for ages, I think that MPs' houses, let alone leader of the opposition's houses, if they've got young children and it's their private home, the press should not use that as a venue. I just don't think it's fair game to besiege somebody's house. Now, he obviously didn't feel able to say that because he doesn't want to start a great, huge war with the media. But I do think that is not right. I don't think public life...
You know what it's like, don't you? What's it been like for you?
Well, certainly over the years, I have had that situation where I've had young children in the house and they've had to go out to school, literally pushing through a mob of press asking questions, and to come back from school with press behind the hedge in the front garden and jumping out. I had to have the curtains closed in the front room because this was before the days of shutters, and things like that. I had to have the curtains closed because otherwise they would come in and take pictures into the front room. And I don't think that is fair for children of politicians to have to put up with that. So I really sympathise with him not having to put up with that. And actually, at one point, I did have to move out of my house because Fathers for Justice, they climbed up the side of my house, and I was in bed with my husband, and I thought, what's going on the side of the house? And I thought it must be squirrels or something like that. There was massive noise. And then it turned out they put an encampment on the roof of my house.
Christ.
So the police said that I had to move out. I had to move out because it was unsafe them being on the roof. So their health and safety on my roof required me to move out of my house. But, my mum, who was, in her 80s or 90s at that point, was very upset that she couldn't come over for Sunday lunch, which she always did every Sunday. So, she was very upset about that. And the neighbours were upset because they had to rope off the street. And it's like, for goodness sake, it's a family home. So that's the first thing. But I think the second thing is, being that was the case, and he did feel he needed to move out in the interests of his family and to create a bit of calm, I think that it would have been good for him to think, should the Labour Party pay for this? Should they pay for my alternative accommodation, or also IPSA, the parliamentary fees and office
He
that
would have
pays
got
for
hammered if
expenses?
taxpayers are paid for that.
Yeah.
You couldn't ask that,
I
actually.
think I think actually Labour Party members probably might not have liked it if he'd have been paid for at the Labour Party's expense. The taxpayers wouldn't have liked it if he'd have been paid for at the taxpayers' expense. But actually, I think at least you avoid the idea that somehow you're putting yourself in the sway of an influence of an individual who's financing you.
I was thinking about what you said last week. If he had followed your advice, he'd have been fine. If he'd said, I did this in opposition, it's not okay in government, my focus is on fixing Britain, I'm not taking any more freebies, he probably could have turned the page on this, but he has left all these threads that are being pulled, and he's kind of explaining it in terms of his love of football or his family, and it keeps the story going. I mean, what is it, Harriet? Is it a communications mishandling? Is it because he doesn't get it? In a way, I didn't want to have to be there asking him about his donations. It's just I did not think the story was finished. Like, I did not feel like there had been a clean explanation for him about the optics about it and how it looked. And I wanted to talk to him about it, and instead we just ended up in this quite unpleasant exchange, actually. Harriet, what do you think? He could have just followed your advice.
Well, I've got a bit of more advice, and I should think it's going to be a lot less welcome than the last, and that is about the football tickets. And probably it'll inflame you as well, Beth, as a football lover. But I think that the difficulty is that football is something that loads and loads of people go to, and they pay for their tickets. So that's the first thing, is it's something that everybody can relate to. So everybody's kind of got an interest in it and feels connected with it. But also there is an issue about government regulation of football. And Arsenal, of course, are big players in the regulation dispute. Now, I confess to not being a football supporter and not knowing all the details of the football regulation, but you can never be sure something won't get into a bit of a row. And what he doesn't want to do is get into a situation where his free tickets into the director's box then become the issue. So I'm looking ahead into the future, and I'm thinking really it makes more sense for him to be watching the football on the telly with his son. And I think that saying, I want to be there with my boy, it's a problem that I can see arising because of the government's involvement with public policy in a situation where Arsenal are, very much in the game of wanting or not wanting what the government's going to do. I think the idea that he can't go and stand in the stands because of security, people really understand that. And therefore, he was offered the director's box because it's secure. The difficulty is that even if he carried on paying his season ticket, the director's box is worth much more. So people will see it as somehow the director's having access to him. And it's actually the perception
And also,
thing that's the thing.
he can pay for the director. He can pay to sit in hospitality. Like, there are different hospitality packages where you're not in the stand at a football match.
I think that the thing is not that Keir Starmer is being pressurised or corrupted at all. But I think what is missing is an understanding of the public perception that actually people are having more influence because of these gifts. And I think on the basis of the experience he's had just now around the clothes and the glasses, it would be wise for him to actually find a way of paying, as Ruth says, for the tickets himself in other sorts of hospitality there, but not necessarily the director's box. I don't know enough about the insides of a football stadium to know whether that's feasible, or not go. But I don't want this to be the next row when the football regulation is going to be really, really important for our national game.
What I didn't get into in this interview, because I was given 7 minutes, I actually took 10 minutes, but only because he wanted to explain and talk, and I did not want to interrupt him. So the interview was a bit longer than it should have been. But I'm telling you, 7 minutes is not long to have an interview with someone. But what I didn't get into, but I agree with you, Harriet, is there is a secondary issue in all of this, and this is the government's announcements, decisions around football regulation. And there's the Arsenal connection with the director's box, but there's also the Football Association providing tickets to concerts at Wembley, etc., that he and other MPs are claiming. And I agree with you, Harriet, that it's again about a perception. And it comes back to me, for me, it comes back to Keir Starmer in opposition framing against Boris Johnson as a politician of integrity, that had high standards in public life, that was putting government back into the service of working people, that was a different type of politician, that wasn't going to take freebies from his rich mates. Remember Boris Johnson and the scandal around Downing Street wallpaper being paid for, the redecorations, and the way in which Labour made hay out of that. Now, they might say, well, actually, it was about the transparency of him not declaring. What the public see is a prime minister taking loads of money from a rich mate. Okay, I went in and this story had emerged. Actually, Nick Robinson had done it on the Today programme about the reason about the flat and his son in the GCSEs. So that was kind of emerging in the morning. They had pre-recorded those interviews at conference on the Tuesday before we got on the plane, right? So they all broke at 7 a.m. in the morning. We were interviewing the Prime Minister at 1 p.m. UK time, okay? So I sort of added a line in about this flat, but that wasn't the focus of my interview. The focus of the interview was I didn't want to get into the weeds of should he go to the stands, should he not go to the stands at Arsenal. What I wanted to do was get into the story about the optics of it and did he get it, which was what we have been talking about. When I asked him about claiming all of the freebies in opposition and the tickets and the clothing, etc., and how that looked, and did he think it had undermined his reputation or messaging, and was he sorry about that? He brought up his son. I did not bring it up. And then we got into this thing where we're now discussing his family. I don't want to discuss his family. He brought it up. My view of it is that I think that, be it on the football or the flat or whatever, he might have justification for it. And he kept saying, there are human reasons behind that. And I wasn't trying to argue that with him. What I wanted to talk to him was about the bigger point. I didn't want to get into a row about tickets for football or whether he should claim this flat and go and live there with his family. What I was trying to say is, do you understand how it looks when you present yourself as one thing and then you allow a perception to build that you're just like the others? You're taking freebies. At one point, I said to him, some people might think this is continuity Johnson. You're taking freebies from rich friends. He was absolutely furious with me. It was really uncomfortable. I felt he was angry with me for asking the questions. I felt that he had not shut this thing down as we had discussed. If he'd said last week, I'm not doing it anymore, it would have gone away. He was angry with me. He was angry with me for raising it. And I felt uncomfortable, but I'm there to ask the questions. And I imagine that if the shoe had been on the other foot and this was a Conservative Prime Minister doing this and he was the leader of the opposition, he would have absolutely expected that person to face scrutiny and answer questions on it.
Well, I think what you saw in that interview was not only indignant that you were asking those questions when you should have been talking about the UN and Hamas and his great victory at the last general election, but also the anxiety of what it is to be a parent in politics, let alone to be a prime minister with young children. And I think the truth is he's going to have to just make a strong choice, which is he has done an incredible thing for the country. He has stepped forward and ended the chaos and instability of the Tory years. But it is hard to have children when you're in public life and high profile. But he's just got to count on and depend on the fact that his public service is the right thing for him to be doing. And ultimately, although there'll be difficulties and bumps along the way in relation to his children, that it's just he's got to make a strong choice to get on with it. And I think that discussing it with the public, discussing that fault line of parental anxiety, it doesn't actually solve the problem. And I don't think actually it makes him more relatable. And I don't think people quite, understand in the same way, because they'll be thinking, well, at least he's got his own accommodation now in Downing Street. I haven't got a house paid for. He's got a salary which is 6 times mine. So I think the idea that you can somehow put yourself on a level with other people who've got anxieties about their children, I don't think you can do that. I don't think it works. I think he just has to make a strong choice. I'm the Prime Minister. I'm going to do a cracking job, and I'm going to protect and love my family as much as I can. And that's what I've chosen to do.
And I think in terms of his family, I think he does have to be a little bit careful, because this is the third time now when he's been under pressure that he's kind of pulled them out. It's not that we're unsympathetic, but when he's been under pressure about how hard he's working and he pulled out the look, we do a Friday night dinner, it is sacrosanct, my wife's Jewish, etc. When he got dicked for doing like 40 grand's worth of football tickets, he was like, yeah, but I take my boy to the football, that's why it's important. Now he's still being asked about all these freebies, like, oh yeah, no, the £20,000 flat was for my son to study. Now, all of these things might be true, but part of when you're a politician, part of protecting your family is actually sometimes not letting the press in. It's just standing up and taking the lumps and maybe not explaining away all of the family side of that. And he probably doesn't have that many more times that when he's under pressure, he has, that he brings the family in before it starts looking as if he's using them as a shield. I don't think that's what he's doing in this case. I think these are all the actual answers. But sometimes protecting your family is not talking about them too.
We can all agree, can't we, here, that being a parent is hard.
Oh, God, yeah. Hardest
and
thing.
Also,
like so
and
hard.
also, being a parent is full of guilt.
Yes.
And being a parent is full of anxiety as well. And combining that with whatever you're doing outside the home, if you're unemployed, you'll feel tortured by guilt and anxiety about your children and why you're unemployed. If you're running the flipping country, you're full with guilt and anxiety about what the impact is on your children of running the country. But at the end of the day, he's just got to get on with it. And I just wish him the best of luck with that. And I'm sure he's a terrific father, as well as I have full confidence in being a Prime Minister. So I would just say, just look forward, get on with it.
I was actually just going to ask you quickly this, because we've had a WhatsApp from Sean, and he says he thinks Starmer looks more relatable because of the way he's publicly defending his family. Can you see that as well? For some people, it makes him more relatable.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think people get that he wants to defend his family, but I also think that, saying that I've got a mate with an £18 million flat that gave me £20,000 worth of a loan of it for my kid isn't that relatable, because not that many people have it in their life. It's not like a common thing. It's not a thing that people have a sense of or can understand. And I think the blind spot that you talked about, Beth, is the blind spot of his own sense of self, and this idea that he believes that he is an upright, rigorous, sort of very serious person, and because of his previous jobs, that sense of morality, that sort of moral courage that he sees in himself, means that he almost doesn't understand why people are questioning him, because he knows it wasn't corrupt. He put it on the register. He followed a rule. If the rule was there, then it can't be wrong. And actually, I think what's he's finding very difficult is that people don't necessarily look at politicians and go, oh, well, if he followed the IPSA rules, that's fine. Like, that's not how life works. And I think that's the difficulty that he's having.
Well, I think although, people might say, well, I find it more relatable, or they might say the same, oh, well, I find it relatable that he loves football. I would say balance against that the problem people will have with the idea that he is actually receiving something of worth, albeit not cash, which he was at pains to point out to you. He is receiving something of value in an issue where he is actually leading the government to legislate on that. So I would say, for all you think you might get the relatability by talking about football and continuing to go to football, the downside is much, much bigger.
Well, look, I think where we've landed then is we've decided that, yes, he's given up, he's not going to take more clothes, he's not going to take more glasses. He said to me it's a judgment call on going to concerts, and he's still going to the football. And I think we've come to the conclusion, well, Harriet, you're certainly saying he needs to stop doing all of it, yeah? Up some? Is that fair?
I think for ministers who are in a particular zone, like whoever's the minister for Formula One, he or she might have to go to Silverstone and watch the cars roar around the track. And I don't think you should have to pay for it if you're going as part of your job. So I think that the rule should be very clear. If you are going to something, not just because it's a leisure thing that you've always enjoyed and you're receiving hospitality, but because you've got to show your face as minister. But if it's a leisure activity for your family, for example, or because you've always enjoyed it in the past, then I would say don't go to that.
Just two things to make clear here. The PM does pay for his tickets, but the security around him suggests he shouldn't use his standard seats. He pays for season tickets, but the security suggests he shouldn't use those seats. And on the flat, no money did change hands. That accommodation was said to be worth £20,000. We'll take a quick break here and then we're going to come back. We'll have more on Starmer's week at conference and reflect on his response to the conflict in the Middle East. Now we're back. Now it was a biggie for Labour this week. Starmer was the first Labour leader in 15 years to address conference as a Prime Minister. Harriet, you were sat in the front row as I crawled past you on my knees, worshipping at the altar of Harriet Harman. Did the mood in the room reflect the mood outside? It was a bit flat, wasn't it, for a newly minted government?
There was a massive amount of excitement. One of the things that you can't tell at all by looking at the news or, the commentary is that, we've shown up at conferences year after year after year, feeling miserable that we lost the last election, complaining about the government, never able to do anything. So therefore, this was the conference in which everybody was really celebrating their success that they'd done and how thoroughly the Tories had been beaten. So we literally went from, at the beginning of this year, 2024, we had 205 Labour MPs. We turn up at conference at the end of this year, 2024, and we've got 404. We've nearly doubled. Some Labour MPs didn't even get a seat in to see the Prime Minister's speech because there was just too many of them. And also, we've got nearly equal numbers of women and men. This great big transformation. We got majority in Scotland, in Wales, and in every region of England. And all those people that were at conference were the people who'd made that happen. So they were like really celebrating and feeling very enthusiastic about it. And they were reflecting that there was some worries about the winter fuel payment, but trusting that people won't suffer if they do get the increase in the number of people claiming pension credit, which means they will get their winter fuel allowance, and also with the triple lock on the pension, increasing the basic state pension and various other measures. So there was a much more positive mood in the conference than you actually saw from the media.
When I went in the hall to watch Starmer's speech, it didn't have the electricity, I would say, of the year before, when it was kind of Labour on the cusp of power and full of hope. And the way I described it in my television report was I sort of said, the hope and hunger of last year has kind of given way a bit to the hard reality of governing. But I at the end of the speech, Harriet, there was, as he kind of went to the end, there was quite a crescendo in the room, wasn't there? But the thing that I would observe is, talking on the sidelines, was that everyone was very on message. Absolutely, absolutely. All the cabinet were, all the advisors, but in some of the sort of later night parties, coffees, little asides around the fringes, when you kind of asked about the rows around Sue Gray and the infighting amongst Spads over Sue Gray and her salary, or the kind of Keir Starmer freebie row, and the way in which, whether people felt it was fair or unfair, it had taken the government off message, I think there was a bit. There was a bit of disquiet, Harry. It wasn't entirely comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was probably a sense that they felt like they had lots of scrutiny as an opposition, and therefore, how could it be any different when you're in government?
I would concede what you're saying, Beth. There was a bit of apprehension and concerns around the government, around the conference. There was apprehension around the conference in the sides of things, where people were saying, I'm worried about the comms, but the PR isn't good enough, the message, the communications isn't good enough. But actually, I think that underlines, there's two things there. One is that there had been some actual missteps. Now, if you've actually done something which you subsequently regret, that's not just about comms. There is the comms about handling it and get yourself out of it, but it is something where there's a problem where you've got to sort it out. So that's not the responsibility of comms, but it's the responsibility of comms to get you out of it quickly, and they didn't quickly enough. And the second point is the one that Ruth alluded to, about what is it that people there can feel is actually happening. And I've been saying, well, they've got the workers' rights, they've got all this great GB wealth, GB energy. They've got the house building and the planning program, and therefore,
but they're headlines. They haven't told us what's behind the headlines.
Yeah. So basically, I was thinking, cut them some slack. They have got some stuff, and I was thinking, we had 2 years of where we had absolute fiscal horrors in 1997, where we were actually sticking to the story, spending limits and cutting, and that was terrible. But then I looked back and looked at all the things that we were doing in exactly this time period.
But I think the thing about the Labour Party conferences, they are setting quite a lot of things in train, but it's going to take some time. And actually, there is a kind of clamour and demand for, if the change is beginning, what are the steps in that process? And there's a bit of a blank canvas. So one thing I did think was really interesting, and I think could give them a bit more momentum going into the budget, is the issue about whether or not Rachel Reeves changes borrowing rules in order to borrow more money to invest in public services. And it looks like she might slightly tinker with the borrowing rules to allow Labour to invest more. And it could be kind of, a couple of tens of billion potentially that they could unlock by this. And I tried to ask Starmer about this yesterday in our interview, because it seemed to me he said there will be no return to Tory austerity, and I'm like, well, I don't know, because like there's a black hole, and you have ruled out loads of tax rises, and you're ruling out spending cuts. So how are you going to square this circle? And I wonder whether actually, for all the doom and gloom, when we get to the budget, they have a slightly more positive story to tell, and they get a little bit of tailwind on that. What do you think, Harriet? Did you pick up any of that at conference?
Well, I did very much. And of course, I saw you asking Keir Starmer that, and him obviously not answer and saying, wait for the budget. But speaking to a couple of the mayors, they're ready with developers, ready to start building on land, ready to get all that going. But unless they've got some capital for the infrastructure, for the roads and the schools, they're not going to be able to go ahead with it. So I think they are going to have to look closely about how they define what is borrowing on the books. And I do think they're going to need to have some creativity there, because otherwise the things that they've set in train might find that they just can't happen because they're restrained by the government borrowing climate.
Well, watch this space. I think we should move on because we're running out of time, because we've been chatting a lot, which I really enjoy myself. And also, I should tell you all that Ruth gave me a care package, which is this. When I got to the hotel, I had an M&S care package, which I'm actually eating as we go along. So I've got my prosciutto ham. Is that how you say it? Oh, no, don't. Let's not have another Haribo moment. Let's just not do that. Prosciutto. I've got some Parma ham. I'm just going to call it that. I've got biscuits. I've eaten the fruit. I've got Mentos, and I've got Percy Pigs. I mean, is that not just gorgeous that I've been given a care package by
Cover
Ruth?
all your major food groups, which was
Except for
salt
vegetables
from the
and
ham.
fruit.
No, there was blueberries and raspberries.
Oh, right.
So a bit of fruit there. I got Peppa Pig for a bit of sweet, and also, just out of complete badness, I got you these amazing sultana cookies that M&S do, which they don't look like much. They're plain. They've got no chocolate or anything fancy in them, but they are, honest to God, the most Moorish like biscuits I've ever had in my entire life.
As I mentioned earlier, Starmer is in New York as we speak for the UN General Assembly, which is basically a big meeting of world leaders. They use it to make policy between United Nations member states. Whilst there, the PM has called for a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah amid growing concerns about the escalating conflict. The PM calling on both sides to pull back from the brink. Now, I don't need to get into the ins and outs of the conflict in the Middle East, but I do think it's worth discussing the UK approach. Harriet, we saw yet more protests about Labour's stance on the Middle East at conference. Is there messaging on it cutting through?
Well, I think in a way, it's more than messaging that is needed here. And I think that it's right that David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and the Prime Minister are just working relentlessly with their allies on this. But above all, the problem here, it seems to me, is that the people in Israel have got terrible leadership in Benjamin Netanyahu. And although they absolutely agree that he must clamp down on Hamas and stop them attacking them, and that he must bring the hostages back, they don't support him. And he is just leading them on a path of escalation, which seems to be making the release of the hostages ever further away. So I think they've got terrible leadership in Israel. They've got terrible leadership in Gaza, and they've also got terrible leadership in Lebanon. So what is being pressed for is a temporary ceasefire to actually then build a peace process. But the people who are going to be needed to build the peace process have showed no inclination at all to get involved in a peace process. Those nations in the region, I think that's the analysis for which they've got to go forward on, because otherwise it's just endless escalation. And if they put boots on the ground in Lebanon, if the Israelis actually go in with soldiers into the Lebanon, we are in for 10 more years of bloodshed.
Benjamin Netanyahu has instructed Israel's military to keep fighting at full force, hasn't yet given his response to the proposed 21-day ceasefire deal that the US, UK and other allies have put forward. So it's not looking it's not looking very hopeful there. Leaders calling for people to step back from the brink, but still the brinkmanship continues.
What's happening in the Middle East is hellishly complicated. Every time Israel takes an action beyond its own self-defense, when it does go on the offensive, it creates future fighters for other people. And it's just this intractable kind of morass, this sort of, whatever the sort of opposite of a virtuous circle is, a vicious circle, or whatever you want to call it. It just makes it ever harder to fix this.
When we were flying over to New York from party conference, the government were gearing up to make the announcement about urging, there's about 10,000 British nationals in Lebanon to evacuate and leave immediately, moving 700 troops over to Cyprus, and getting ready to evacuate British citizens. And the PM, actually, we weren't going to do a huddle on the plane over. I think they're going to do one on the way back. I'm already back, but obviously, so I won't be there. But he did agree to come up the back of the plane, and there were 4 questions. And he looked absolutely knackered, I have to say. And he did say he was tired. He must have been on an adrenaline crash after the speech. But he came up the plane to talk about how concerned he was to put this message out to British nationals to evacuate. Then when we went and did the interviews the next morning, we asked him to do a pool clip. A pool clip is when all of the broadcasters use the same piece of footage and we put them all on our channels. We said, instead of us all asking you about the Lebanon evacuation, can you just do a clip at the top? And he did. And then when I went in to interview him, he said, are you going to ask me about Lebanon? And I said, no, because you've already done a pool clip that we're going to all use. And he said to me, I just really want to make sure I get that message out that people need to leave now. And I could see he was very, very preoccupied about it. It is, and you can see the frustration as well, going back to where we began, that he's been asked about his own freebie stuff, and he's actually trying to deal with evacuating British citizens, and he's dealing with Zelensky going to the UN with his victory plan, and he's trying to unlock long-range missiles for the US. And I mean, what a plate he has. Just to finish off, though, talking about plates, Harriet, how unfortunate was it when the Prime Minister said the blunder where he called for the release of sausages and he corrected it to the release of hostages at conference? Did you notice it in the hall?
I sort of noticed there'd been a minor slip of the tongue, but quite frankly, I knew what he was saying, so I didn't think much of it, really. And, everybody's going to make slips of the tongue at some point or another. So, I just didn't think much of it, really. And I'm not even going to mention.
I just thought, there for the grace of God go I, because the amount of times I've nearly messed up on an auto cue, it happens.
It reminded me of a previous Tory party conference. There was a great one that the Welsh leader of the Tories, Andrew R.T. Davies, did, where he talks about, and he's a big broth of a man. He's a Welsh farmer, and he's quite, how do I say this in a nice way, statuesque. And he was talking about, I mean, this was several years ago now, and he was talking about, and we've got to make breakfast work instead of Brexit. And actually, he was very funny about it because he realised what he'd said.
Breakfast had clearly been working for him.
Breakfast had clearly been working for him, and he was able to laugh it off. And I think the difficulty for Starmer was because of the seriousness of the point that he was making.
You can't be laughing when you're talking about hostages. Yeah.
His brain, he's a smart enough guy and he's light enough on his feet that his brain would have been sort of running on how to fix it. And actually, he did the right thing.
That's all we have time for today. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's come to see us on tour this month. We have absolutely loved it. It's been an utter joy. And hopefully it won't be the last of our live shows. I have got to hang out with Harriet and Ruth. I've had a lot of fun. We're going to have to do another tour because that's all I want to do now.
Do you know, I didn't know what to expect, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you, ladies, for being such good fun to hang out with, because I was a bit nervous about this tour, but it's been really good.
And also in Liverpool, every time Harriet spoke, she got a round of applause. I was like, this is nice. Did you like that, Harriet?
Well, it was incredible how I was so surprised when I when I went to conference, because usually, people talk to me about what I've done as an MP or what I might have done as a minister and things like that. But all they wanted to say was, "We love the pod." And I'm like, oh my goodness me. And there was a member of the PLP that I won't mention his name, but I don't think I've spoken to him for absolutely ages. I've never worked closely with him. And he came zooming up and he said, "I love the pod." And I thought, this is really connecting with in a whole load of ways, which I never would have anticipated. It's joyful.
Well, I love it too. And Harriet, I just love the branding of Harriet Harman, co-host Electoral Dysfunction. She's no longer Baroness. She's no longer former deputy leader of the Labour Party or Mother of the House. She is a podcaster now. We have claimed her as our own, and I'm keeping her.
It's all about the pod.
And to explain to people, that's how the little Aston, which is the little line that says who you are on telly, that's what popped up when you were on Newsnight the other night. It said Harriet Harman, co-host Electoral Dysfunction. Hurrah!
Now, remember, if you've got something you want to ask us, send us a voice note to the burner phone 07934 200 444 or email us at electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Thank you so much for listening. Get in touch and we'll be back next week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.